There's a moment in geopolitics when a chess move that looks minor on the surface actually reshapes the entire board. Right now, we're watching one of those moments unfold in real time, and almost nobody in the mainstream press is telling you what it actually means. The question being asked in intelligence circles, in think tanks, and in quiet government corridors isn't just whether Russia will help Iran enrich uranium. The real question is whether the architecture of nuclear non-proliferation, the entire post-Cold War framework that the United States spent decades building, is being quietly dismantled, piece by piece, right in front of our eyes. And here's what I want you to hold on to as we go through this together. There is a critical realization buried in the middle of all this that most analysts are completely missing, and I'll unpack it fully before we're done, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let's start with where we actually are. The news cycle has been buzzing with reports about Russian nuclear cooperation with Iran, framed largely as a proliferation threat, a rogue state alliance, or another chapter in the axis of evil narrative that Washington has been recycling since the early 2000s. But if you accept that framing at face value, you've already lost the thread. Because the framing itself is a marketing ploy. It's designed to trigger a specific emotional response in you, to make you see this as a binary story of good guys and bad guys, when the reality is an extraordinarily complex strategic realignment that has been building for decades. To understand why Russia and Iran are drawing closer together, and why nuclear cooperation, including potentially uranium enrichment expertise, is on the table, you have to go back further than most commentators dare. You have to go back to the 1990s, to the moment when the Soviet Union collapsed and the United States had a genuine historic opportunity to build an inclusive post-Cold War security architecture. Instead of doing that, what happened? NATO expanded eastward. Promises made to Gorbachev were broken. Russia was treated not as a potential partner but as a defeated power to be managed, marginalized, and eventually dismembered. That wound never healed. And everything you're watching today, Ukraine, the Middle East, Iran, the nuclear question, is downstream of that original strategic error. Iran's story runs parallel in many ways. Here is a country that had its democratically elected government overthrown in 1953 in a CIA and MI6 orchestrated coup because it dared to nationalize its own oil industry. It then endured decades of the Shah's brutal Washington-backed autocracy. When the revolution came in 1979, it wasn't simply an Islamist uprising. It was also, at its core, a nationalist explosion of rage against foreign interference. And ever since, the United States has never quite forgiven Iran for throwing off that control. Every sanction, every military threat, every regime change operation has to be understood through that historical lens. Iran isn't developing its nuclear program in a vacuum. It's developing it in a world where it watched what happened to Libya after Gaddafi gave up his weapons program, and what happened to Iraq when it couldn't prove a negative about weapons it didn't have. The lesson the Iranian leadership drew, and frankly it's a rational lesson, is that nuclear capability is the only true guarantee of national sovereignty in a world where the United States reserves the right to topple governments it doesn't like. Now ask yourself this: if you were sitting in Tehran, having watched Libya, Iraq, and Ukraine, would you make a different calculation? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Leave your perspective in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of question that deserves more than a headline. So when we talk about Russian nuclear experts potentially assisting Iran with uranium enrichment, we have to understand that this isn't happening in a moral vacuum. It's happening in a world where the United States unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, in 2018 under the Trump administration, despite Iran being in full compliance according to international inspectors. It's happening in a world where maximum pressure sanctions were reimposed, crippling the Iranian economy, pushing ordinary Iranian civilians into poverty, and destroying any domestic political constituency for moderation. When you burn the bridge of diplomacy, you shouldn't be surprised when the people on the other side start building a different kind of bridge entirely. Russia's motivations here are layered in ways that require careful unpacking. On the surface, there's the obvious strategic logic. The enemy of my enemy is, if not my friend, at least a useful partner. Russia and Iran share a border region of immense strategic sensitivity, the Caucasus and Central Asia, and they've learned through hard experience that their interests in stabilizing those regions are often better served through cooperation than competition. They fought proxy conflicts in Syria on the same side. Iranian drones have become a significant factor in the Ukrainian battlefield, a development that has deepened the military-industrial relationship between Moscow and Tehran, in ways that are only now becoming fully visible to Western intelligence analysts. But to understand why this matters at the deeper level, we have to look at what Russia is actually trying to achieve geopolitically. Vladimir Putin has been remarkably consistent in his messaging, far more consistent than Western media gives him credit for. What he has argued for at least 2 decades is that the post-Cold War unipolar world dominated by the United States is neither stable nor legitimate, and that a genuine multipolar order, one in which major civilizational powers like Russia, China, India, and yes, Iran have recognized spheres of influence and genuine strategic autonomy, is both inevitable and necessary. The nuclear cooperation question with Iran has to be read as part of that larger project. It's not just about Iran getting enrichment technology, it's about demonstrating that the American monopoly on deciding who gets to be a legitimate nuclear actor and who gets sanctioned, bombed, or regime changed for trying is over. This is where we approach the critical realization I mentioned at the start, but let me build toward it properly because it deserves the full context it requires. The International Atomic Energy Agency has been in a complex dance with Iran for years. As of the most recent reporting available, Iran has enriched uranium to 60% purity, below the 90% weapons-grade threshold, but well beyond anything justified by civilian energy needs. The IAEA has also raised serious concerns about undeclared nuclear material and restricted access to certain facilities. None of this is comfortable information, but here's what the mainstream narrative consistently omits. The trajectory of Iran's enrichment program accelerated dramatically after the United States withdrew from the JCPOA. The deal was working. International inspectors confirmed it was working. And it was abandoned anyway, not because of Iranian violations, but because of domestic American politics and Israeli lobbying pressure. When you poison the well of diplomacy that thoroughly, you lose the moral authority to be outraged by what grows in the desert you created. Russia's role in Iran's nuclear program is not new. Russia built the Bushehr nuclear power plant, which came online in 2011 after years of construction delays partly attributable to Western pressure on Moscow to slow the project. Russia has been Iran's primary nuclear infrastructure partner for decades. What's changed now is the context, the intensity, and the strategic stakes. With Russia under unprecedented Western sanctions following the Ukraine war, with the two countries deeply integrated in military supply chains, and with both facing what they perceive as an existential confrontation with American hegemony, the taboo against deeper nuclear cooperation, including potentially enrichment-related expertise, has almost certainly weakened. Now, there's an important distinction that often gets lost in the noise. There is a significant difference between helping Iran with civilian nuclear technology, which Russia is legally permitted to do under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty framework, and providing direct assistance with weapons-grade enrichment or weaponization. No credible source has yet provided hard evidence that Russia has crossed that second line. But the direction of travel is unmistakable, and the structural incentives pushing toward deeper cooperation are stronger today than at any point in the post-Cold War era. And that brings up a question I want to put directly to you watching this. Do you believe the United States still has the diplomatic credibility and strategic leverage to stop that cooperation? Because I think the honest answer to that question tells us something profound about where American power actually stands right now. Israel, for its part, has been conducting what amounts to a sustained covert war against Iran's nuclear program for years, assassinating scientists, sabotaging centrifuge facilities, launching what appears to have been the Stuxnet cyber attack in cooperation with the United States. The Mossad's fingerprints are visible on multiple operations inside Iranian territory. From a purely tactical standpoint, these operations have set back Iran's program by years, but from a strategic standpoint, they may have achieved the opposite of their intended effect. Every assassination, every sabotage, every act of covert violence has strengthened the hand of the Iranian hardliners who argue that Iran is in an existential confrontation with the West and Israel, and that only a genuine nuclear deterrent can protect the Islamic Republic. You cannot bomb your way to non-proliferation. History has demonstrated this repeatedly, and yet the lesson remains stubbornly unlearned in certain capitals. Let's bring China into this picture, because the geopolitical architecture we're discussing cannot be understood without Beijing. China has its own complex relationship with Iran. It has been buying Iranian oil at discounted prices, providing a financial lifeline that has partly blunted the impact of American sanctions. China is deeply invested in the Belt and Road connectivity that runs through Iranian territory, and China has its own reasons for wanting to see a multipolar nuclear order rather than one defined exclusively by American preferences. The China-Russia-Iran triangulation is not a formal alliance. It's more like a convergence of strategic interests among powers that have each, in different ways, concluded that the existing American-dominated order is hostile to their core interests. They don't need a formal treaty, they need the shared interest, and that interest is abundantly present. But to understand why this matters in ways that cut closer to home for the American audience, we have to look at what the end state of this trajectory actually looks like, because here's the uncomfortable truth. The United States has used nuclear non-proliferation as both a genuine security goal and as a geopolitical tool simultaneously, and those two uses have progressively undermined each other. The NPT system works when it is applied consistently and fairly. It breaks down when it is applied selectively. When India gets a nuclear deal despite never signing the NPT, when Israel's arsenal is never officially acknowledged, when North Korea faces maximum pressure while Saudi Arabia is promised civilian nuclear cooperation as a geopolitical sweetener. The world notices the inconsistency, and states like Iran draw the obvious conclusion: non-proliferation norms apply to adversaries of the United States, not to friends of the United States, and therefore the norms themselves are not really about preventing nuclear weapons. They're about maintaining American geopolitical dominance. This is the critical realization. Are you ready for it? Because it reframes everything. The debate about whether Russian nuclear experts will assist Iran with uranium enrichment is, in one sense, the wrong debate. It's a tactical question being asked in place of a strategic one. The strategic question is this: has the United States, through decades of selective application of non-proliferation norms, unilateral withdrawal from working diplomatic agreements, covert military operations against sovereign states, and the weaponization of the global financial system through sanctions, fundamentally destroyed the legitimacy of the non-proliferation architecture it claims to be defending? Because if the answer to that question is yes, and I would argue the evidence points strongly in that direction, then we are not watching Russia enable Iranian proliferation. We are watching the inevitable consequence of a broken system finally revealing itself. Russia isn't breaking the non-proliferation order. The order was broken from within by the power that claimed to be its guardian. This is not an argument for Iranian nuclear weapons. Let me be absolutely clear about that. A nuclear-armed Iran would create genuine instability risks, would likely trigger a regional proliferation cascade in a part of the world that is already extraordinarily volatile, and would introduce new and complex deterrence calculations that no serious person should be casual about. The stakes here are existential in the most literal sense, but acknowledging those stakes honestly requires also acknowledging how we got here honestly, and the mainstream American narrative, which frames this entirely as Russian aggression and Iranian rogue behavior, is not an honest accounting. It is a narrative designed to protect the mythology of American benevolence from the weight of its own contradictions. What can actually be done? This is where I want to spend our final moments together, because geopolitical analysis that ends only with diagnosis and no direction is just sophisticated hand-wringing. The architecture for a resolution exists. It was called the JCPOA, and a more comprehensive version of it, one that addresses Iran's legitimate security concerns, provides sanctions relief in exchange for verifiable limits on enrichment, and includes genuine regional security guarantees, is technically achievable. Iran has repeatedly signaled through back channels and through public statements by its foreign ministry that it is not categorically opposed to a negotiated settlement. Even the current hardline government in Tehran understands that economic isolation is slowly strangling the country. The problem is not Iranian intransigence. The problem is the domestic political economy of the United States and Israel, where any accommodation with Iran is politically costly, and where the military-industrial complex, the think tank ecosystem, and the lobbying infrastructure are heavily weighted toward escalation over diplomacy. Russia's potential role in nuclear cooperation with Iran, then, functions simultaneously as a genuine proliferation risk and as a pressure point in a much larger negotiation. Moscow knows that Western powers are deeply alarmed by the prospect of Russian-Iranian nuclear collaboration. That alarm is leverage. Whether Russia uses that leverage to extract concessions on Ukraine, on NATO posture, on sanctions, or on some other element of the broader geopolitical negotiation is the actual strategic game being played. The nuclear cooperation card is simultaneously real and performative. It's real enough to be credible as a threat, and performative enough to function as a bargaining chip. understanding that dual nature is essential to reading Russian strategic behavior accurately, which is something American policymakers have consistently failed to do, trapped as they are in a narrative framework that allows for no nuance in how Russian intentions are interpreted. There is a broader moral dimension to this that I think deserves to be stated plainly, because it's often left out of the geopolitical conversation in the interest of appearing neutral. The populations bearing the greatest cost of all these strategic games are ordinary people, Iranian civilians crushed by sanctions, Ukrainian families in a war that was entirely preventable had different strategic choices been made a decade ago, Russian citizens bearing the economic weight of a conflict their government launched. The leaders making these chess moves are not the ones suffering their consequences. That asymmetry between those who make decisions and those who pay the price is a constant feature of great power politics, and it should make all of us, regardless of national allegiance, fundamentally skeptical of the narratives constructed by any government to justify its strategic choices. So let me ask you the final question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely mean this as an invitation for your own deep reflection rather than a rhetorical device. If the United States were to announce tomorrow a genuine, comprehensive diplomatic initiative toward Iran, one that acknowledged past American interventions honestly, offered real sanctions relief tied to real verification, and included a regional security framework, do you believe the American political system as currently constructed is capable of sustaining that initiative through an election cycle? Because I think how you answer that question tells you more about the future of nuclear proliferation than anything Russia does or doesn't do in Tehran. The limiting factor in global nuclear security right now may not be in Moscow or Tehran. It may be in Washington. The chessboard is being rearranged at a pace that the old players are struggling to track, let alone control. And the pieces that seemed permanent, American dominance, the non-proliferation consensus, the dollar-based sanctions architecture, are showing cracks that no amount of aggressive posturing can conceal. What comes next depends enormously on whether the United States can find the strategic clarity to lead through adaptation rather than doubling down on a dominance model that the rest of the world is actively working to rout around. That's not pessimism, that's the most urgent kind of realism there is.